Hey, y'all, I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. I'm glad you're with us. We're going to have a really fun show today. Mike Griffith is going to be with us later on. We'll look back at yesterday's appearance for the UGA football team at Camp Sunshine there at Camp Twin Lakes in Rutledge, Georgia. I think one of the important things that Georgia does during the offseason, or really any time of the year, raising awareness for a camp, doing a great service for some families that could really use it. And, boy, what another great story that came out of that yesterday. We'll talk to Mike Griffith more about that. A lot of football stuff as well. I'll reference something that Jeff Sintel put on the DawgNation forum yesterday regarding I think of anyway, kind of a fan favorite recruit for the class of 2020. Remains to be seen what his relationship with Georgia is, but I think you'll find this to be interesting. We'll do that coming up. And I want to start the show by talking about Deandre Swift and the cast of running backs around him and why the situation for Swift at Georgia this year might be a little different than some in the national media might think. I'll explain what I mean next as DawgNation Daily begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I don't know if you feel this way, but I find myself, now that we're kind of mid-June, heading towards July, I find my college football reading getting a little bit more serious this time of year, and I find when I kind of dig in on a subject, I find myself diving a little deeper on it than I probably would have, say, 3 or 4 weeks ago. To me, it starts to feel like the season's getting a lot closer. Certainly the start of practice is getting a lot closer, and I kind of dug deep on something yesterday in preparation for today's show, and ultimately what I found was maybe a little bit of a surprise for me. I'll explain why. But I want to start with Deandre Swift, and I want to start by saying that I think there's an expectation that some of the national media seemingly have for Swift that I think could end up maybe being wrong. This is not a bad thing necessarily. It's just different than some might believe. I love lists. I make no apology for that. If you rank anything in college football, I will read your list. I will talk about your list, and I'll probably then make my own list as a response to what you put out there. You rank teams, you rank players, you rank coaches, you rank anything. I just like that kind of stuff this time of year because I like college football conversations. Well, USA Today has been ranking the various position groups around college football. They ranked their running backs recently, and they put Deandre Swift as the number 3 back in the country behind Jonathan Taylor from Wisconsin and Travis Etienne from Clemson. That's not a huge surprise one way or another. You may say, well, I think that Swift's better than both those guys, and he very well may end up proving that over the course of the season, but in some form or fashion, the 3 top backs in the country, for the most part, are considered to be Swift, along with Taylor, who gets a ton of carries at Wisconsin, and Travis Etienne, who obviously was on the national champion and played pretty big in some big games for Clemson a year ago. But it is what the writer at USA Today, Paul Meyerberg, says about Deandre Swift in ranking him number 3 in his list of running backs that I thought was the most interesting, and I think this sets us up for a pretty interesting conversation here today. Here's what Meyerberg writes about Swift, his number 3 back. He says that Swift's talent has outweighed his touches across his first 2 years with the Bulldogs, though his production saw a significant uptick across the second half of last season. And I may even say, really, it's more the final third of the season, maybe more so than the second half, but nonetheless, that's essentially true. Meyerberg then goes on to say he's in line for even more carries as a junior. Now, I want to park on that sentence right there in particular, that Deandre Swift is in line for even more carries as a junior than he had as a sophomore. This would seem to be obvious, right? I mean, there were 5 games a year ago where Swift had fewer than 10 carries. He didn't have 20 carries in any game a season ago. And we have been left to assume that part of the reason why there were games, especially early in the season when Swift didn't get a lot of work, is because he was a little banged up, a little injured. Now, Georgia has guarded the secret of Deandre Swift's groin like the United States guards its nuclear secrets. There's some conflicting information here. Go back to November, Kirby Smart after the Auburn game, essentially disregarding any thought of the groin surgery that at that point in time the beat writers around the program had become aware of. Kirby Smart disregarding that as any factor at all in why Swift was lightly used near the beginning of the season. For some context, here is Kirby then.
He may tell you that. I don't know. I mean, he had the surgery over the spring, and that was something that he recovered from over the summer. And he really came to fall camp and was moving around well. He had a setback in fall camp a couple times that it bothered him, and I think it bothered him early in the season some. But Deandre's always been a competitor, works hard, he plays for the big moment, does a really good job. But I think the surgery was during the spring.
So he acknowledges a setback and acknowledges maybe that was bothering him a little bit at the beginning of the season. But Kirby Smart, to my knowledge, never at any point in time last year said the reason why we're not giving him very many carries in September and October is because of the fact that he's still battling this groin injury and he's not fully 100%. Now, Kirby, as a head coach, I guess, he has a right. It's his prerogative to kind of keep some of this injury stuff a little bit secret, but it seemed like Smart at times was especially secretive when it came to Swift's status from a year ago. Deandre Swift, for what it's worth, was more forthcoming. In fact, he talked to Mike Griffith before the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans and went into pretty great detail about just all the extra work that he was doing to make sure he was fully healthy. The best of Deandre that we saw in November, apparently that became possible because of the rigorous schedule that Swift followed to make sure his body was in tip-top shape by the time you got to that point. Here is Swift in his own words.
Just getting back healthy was a big thing for me. I know when I'm healthy, like I said, the sky's the limit for me.
How involved was it? How many days a week were you in the training room? What time were you going?
Every day of the week. Wake up at 6 o'clock, go get treatment before I had to go to class. I would go to tutoring, come back and get treatment. I had to go back to class, come back and get treatment before practice. So it was an ongoing process, daily thing. But I know what I had to do to get back onto the field because nobody likes being injured.
So DeAndre Swift says nobody likes being injured, so I'm doing the work necessary to make sure I'm fully healthy. And the assumption I'm going to make here is in 2019 that groin injury is a thing of the past. And despite the fact that Robert Edwards, the great former Georgia running back, told us this spring that Swift was dealing with a little bit of an ankle during spring practice, my assumption is that DeAndre Swift is going to be fully healthy for the 2019 season, which would bring back to what Paul Meyerberg said a little earlier. That means he's in line for even more carries. However, here's where I think, based on some recent stats for Georgia, you might have to pump the brakes on this a little bit. I mentioned a moment ago that Swift didn't have 20 carries in any game last year. But you know what I was kind of surprised to go back and find? And for some reason, I just assumed the numbers on this would be different, but they weren't. I went back and looked at the 2017 season for Georgia, which is the high water mark for Kirby thus far as UGA coach. Of those two great backs that Georgia had that season, DeAndre Swift obviously been the third, but of the two leading backs that Georgia had that season, Nick Chubb and Sony Michel, do you realize that only one of them had 20 carries in any game all season long? That was Nick Chubb, and he only reached the 20-carry mark in one game that season. It was against South Carolina. So every other game in 2017, which would seem to be the blueprint for Georgia offensive success because Georgia won the SEC, made the college football playoff, every game that year, both Chubb and Michel finished with fewer than 20 carries except for one, which kind of sets you up for a situation in 2019, that the assumption that now that DeAndre Swift's fully healthy, now that he's not dealing with a groin injury anymore, he's ready to get a whole lot more carries. He's ready to put a number on that, ready to start getting 20-plus carries a game. Recent Georgia history in terms of how it's used its running backs would suggest that's not the case, because prior to 2017, both Chubb and Michel had plenty of games where they carried it more than 20 times. Under Kirby Smart in 2016, Chubb especially. For Sony Michel in 2015, when Chubb got hurt, he carried more than 20 times in a game several times. To go back to 2014, once again a Mark Richt year, Chubb had some games where he carried it more than 30 times. But under Kirby Smart in 2017, the load was a lot more balanced, which would suggest that in 2019, even with a fully healthy DeAndre Swift, you may see a similar degree of balance where Swift is fully healthy and fully utilized, but maybe not the tune of 20 carries a game, which puts an extra spotlight on Georgia this season, on the other running backs, guys like Samir White, for instance, guys like Brian Herrien, for instance. Now, the good news is there's a lot of indication that they may be ready for that spotlight moment. I'll take you back to the spring here for a moment. Do you remember the post-game show we did at the UGA bookstore with the former Georgia linebacker Natrez Patrick? Natrez Patrick, when I asked him about, I guess you haven't seen Samir White, but what do you expect when you do see him? I thought that Natrez Patrick gave a very interesting answer to that question. Here's what Natrez said at the time.
But I have. So let me tell you, the spring, right before he got injured. So he was practicing. I think he got injured like in the end of his first spring, towards the end of his first spring. And when I tell you, he ripped us apart, literally like so hard to tackle. No one could tackle him one-on-one, like, because he actually did a couple scrimmages. I think he did the first scrimmage, maybe the second scrimmage.
This would have been in August.
Of course, yeah. And we could not tackle him. Like, we couldn't bring him down, and he ran really tough. So I'm excited to see what he's going to do to people in the opposite color jersey. So I can't wait, man. I'm glad his recovery is going well.
Yeah.
I hope that he'll be back soon.
So listen, Natrez Patrick's a proud guy. He was a good linebacker for this program, and his other fellow defensive starters are proud guys as well. When he says Samir White ripped us apart and we couldn't tackle him one-on-one, Natrez Patrick, if he's saying that, I'm going to take him at his word. And Kirby Smart has also said that guy, the one that Natrez said couldn't be tackled, is now cleared for practice and will be a part of full contact stuff when Georgia kicks off its summer practices later on this summer. Samir White, I believe, is going to be a big part of the Georgia running game this season to go as a complement to Deandre Swift, not necessarily in a secondary role, but as I said before, kind of a complementary role. And I think that Brian Herrien's got a big part in this as well. He's the veteran. He's been biding his time. His recruiting profile, not quite as robust as Swift's or White, but he may be a pretty good player himself. In fact, Kirby Smart alluded to that very point after G-Day once again back in April. Here's more from the coach.
Brian's a good back. Brian's gotten better. I mean, I've seen Brian not necessarily this spring, but I've seen him. You got to remember, he's been here for several springs, and one of those springs he carried the ball 20, 30 times when Nick and Sony were coming back as seniors. So I've seen a lot of body of work from Brian. He's got really good skill set of catching the ball. He's got a good understanding of our offense, and I thought he was really productive today.
So listen, let me kind of wrap all of this up here for a moment. I really believe that the Georgia running game in 2019 is not going to be Deandre Swift as the superstar getting 75% of the carries. I think it's more of an, I don't want to say evenly distributed, but more closer to even distribution between Samir White, Deandre Swift, and Brian Herrien. But here was the surprising thing about some of the research I did yesterday. Georgia's going to really need that because when you look at teams like, say, Clemson, for instance, balanced rushing attack is a lot more a part of their offensive profile than I kind of realized. Travis Etienne gets a lot of the highlights for them, and obviously Trevor Lawrence is a well-regarded quarterback. But their number 2 running back, Lynn J. Dixon, last year averaged nearly 9 yards per carry. And I would say that he's probably in line for more carries here this season. So when it comes to a stable of running backs, unfortunately, Clemson's probably got one of those as well. And when it comes to Georgia's pursuit of a national championship, being that good in that regard is going to be really important. Being better than Alabama, who's going to put guys like Brian Robinson in a bigger role than he's been in before in his Alabama career, that comparison is going to go on as well. We certainly expect the rushing attack to be a big part of the story of how Georgia succeeds or not here in 2019. But it's not just Deandre Swift who's going to be leading the way in that regard. It's going to be that collection of Georgia running backs, and I'm really curious to see how all of this plays out. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Hello to you, and thanks for being with us. Live on video today, 10 a.m., DawgNation, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, radio at noon, of course, on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref. Enjoyed being on the radio with them this morning, as I do each and every Wednesday morning. And, of course, podcast form, Apple, Google, the world-famous DawgNation.com. Just great to have you with all of that. By the way, go to DawgNation.com right now and find out more information about our DawgNation Days of Summer. We're still basking in the glow of what happened last week and looking ahead now to Thursday, August 1st, Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa. What an incredible event this is going to be as the next big phase of DawgNation Days of Summer rolls on. Mountains of North Georgia, Towns County could not be more beautiful. Very, very close to Lake Chatuge. This is a great getaway. Many of you have already booked your rooms. You've kind of gotten in our VIP experience. We've got a limited number of those spots left, so go to DawgNation.com and find out more information about that. If you don't mind, I want to kind of keep the running back conversation going here for a moment as we transition to our Around the Doghouse, brought to you today by our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia. By the way, are going to be hanging out with us later on in our DawgNation World headquarters a little bit later on. Get a chance to have lunch with those folks today, and I cannot wait for that. But on the subject of Around the Doghouse, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia today, let me talk about something that Jeff Sintel put yesterday in the DawgNation Forum. You can find the forum at forum.dawgnation.com. And Jeff told us this yesterday when he was with us on the program, that a lot of those like recruiting nuggets, he's starting to kind of populate in there. The great news is the forum's completely free, so just simply go and read some of this stuff. But I wanted to highlight something in particular for a moment involving Tank Bigsby, a running back from the state of Georgia, one of the top players in the country, but a guy whose relationship with Georgia has been a little bit hard to decipher. Is Georgia interested in him? Is Bigsby interested in Georgia? Sometimes it's not completely clear. But here's what Jeff reported yesterday on the DawgNation Forum. He says that Tank Bigsby will be in Athens today on an unofficial visit. This would have been yesterday. This was Jeff from the forum yesterday. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with UGA and Bigsby over the summer and early fall cycle here. Others recruit the nation's number 8 running back and number 50 overall prospect harder. He means other programs are more in on Bigsby seemingly than Georgia is. But Jeff says somewhat cryptically, if Georgia opts to make him a true priority, who knows what could happen. That's what Jeff Sintel wrote in the DawgNation Forum yesterday. Last week on Before the Hedges presented by Kroger, the subject of Bigsby also came up there, and here's what Jeff said out loud as a part of that program.
I don't think he'll grow tired of waiting. I think Bigsby, there's some concern about his top-end speed, how overall fast he is. And then the other concern is he's just not that big 210-pound back that Georgia's looking for. Zachary Evans is not either, but then he has the lethal game-breaking speed as well. I just think Tank Bigsby, we say this a lot with Tank, and it should not come across as an insult, that he's clearly one of the nation's top 10 running backs this year. But I don't know. It doesn't seem like he's exactly what Georgia wants when it tries to take its first pick out of the backs available to Georgia in this country.
So I think it's interesting what Jeff says there at the end. Bigsby's not what Georgia wants when it takes its first pick of the backs. But Kendall Milton, who was on campus this past weekend and greatly entertained by Georgia, that may be more of an example of UJ's first pick on this. For those of you who watch the show or listen to the show regularly, you know I'm a big believer that Georgia needs 2 elite backs this cycle. Would Bigsby be willing to be a tandem partner along with Kendall Milton if someone like, say, Zachary Evans is just simply not willing to share the spotlight there in that regard? I think things get really interesting in relationship to that discussion, especially given the fact that one of the programs recruiting him hard is South Carolina is seemingly also recruiting him to be part of a tandem. They've got the commitment of Marshawn Lloyd. This is a subject that I'm not going to let go of. I do think Georgia needs that second elite back. I'd love for it to be Zachary Evans, but I like Tank Bigsby too. I think this was going to be fun to watch as Georgia tries to fill a need. After this year, they'll need elite running backs, and Bigsby would seem to, in a lot of ways, fit the bill on that. It's Around the Doghouse. It's presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And this time of year, when you're outside, you see those cracks in the foundation, or you're down in your basement. My kids love to play in ours. And if you ever notice that like wet spot or damp stuff, moisture creeping through your house, affecting the structural integrity of your home, can be a serious issue. That's why you want to trust a serious company to help you with that, one that has a full-time engineer on staff. It's why DawgNation Daily recommends Engineered Solutions of Georgia. The great news is getting in touch with Engineered Solutions of Georgia could not be easier. The phone number is simply 678-ESOG-NOW. That number, once again, 678-ESOG-NOW. That'll get you in touch with Engineered Solutions of Georgia. All right, I got a lot more coming up later on in the program, including an interesting look around the SEC. But for now, on what was a big day for the Georgia Bulldogs off the football field yesterday, let's talk to our buddy Mike Griffith.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Mike Griffith joins us here on DawgNation Daily, and obviously, Mike, there's a lot of regular football stuff that I want to talk to you about while we have you on the phone here, but I do want to begin our discussion by talking about what happened yesterday. For those who are maybe not aware, although by now many Georgia fans are, the Georgia team spends some time each year at a camp called Camp Sunshine. Now, Camp Sunshine takes place in Rutledge, Georgia at a facility called Camp Twin Lakes. I've been lucky enough to be at Camp Twin Lakes a lot in the past because Camp Sunshine's not the only camp that it serves. It serves a lot of camps for children who have extra medical needs. It's a facility set up to handle that. But Camp Sunshine may be among the most famous there, and it's a personal connection for Kirby Smart because of his brothers Carl and the leukemia that he's dealt with. And, Mike, I see the video that you've shot. I've seen a lot of the things that Georgia's put out on this, and to say that it's moving is an understatement. Obviously, you and I both have kids. I have young kids right now, so this is particularly poignant for me to see some of the families who are dealing with this and battling with this. Let me just start by asking just kind of a simple question. What's it like to be there in person, and what's it like to experience this in kind of a up-close and personal manner?
Yeah, it's really hard. It's it's a unique experience, BA, and the thing that overcomes or overwhelms you isn't the despair. Even though you realize that a lot of these kids are going through things that are more difficult than we can imagine, things that, as you said, we fear for our own children. But the strength and the positive, I'm struggling to explain it because, these kids are so strong and so positive. It's absolutely overwhelming. I struggle to draw an analogy. It's like that football fan, the team is down by 4 touchdowns, and they still believe they're going to win. And they're still having a good time at the game. And these kids, it's like Mo was saying, that one of the founders and the organizer said, these kids take the same approach into every day that Kirby preaches for his football team as far as don't ever give up, fight till the end, stay positive, play for one another. I mean, it's really happening. it's 13 and 12 and 15-year-olds that I'm listening to their testimony. You know, I'll just say this. I'm going to write a story, but I was talking to a 13-year-old leukemia survivor, and I asked him what it meant for the Georgia football players to be there. And he said, you know, it means a lot. He said, it means to a lot of my friends that have just been diagnosed or that are going through the treatments. It's really good for them. You know, he was excited for himself, but his thought was how the Georgia football players were helping his teammates, his friends.
Yeah.
I mean, for a 13-year-old to have that awareness and level of understanding for others that are going through a difficult time, it was a perspective I just didn't expect to hear that from a 13-year-old, and you know, really, it really warmed my heart.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And I heard something that Kirby Smart said yesterday, where he talked about how, and he almost said this, you know, semi-tongue-in-cheek, about the fact that, you know, he talks about adversity all the time and his team battling adversity, but the kind of adversity that Kirby Smart talks about is not real-world adversity. It's simply within the confines of the white lines of a football field, whereas on the other hand, the young children and the families of those children who attend Camp Sunshine, they are dealing with real adversity. They are dealing with real potential distractions, and yet their ability, and I thought you just described it very well, their ability to respond to that and truly, to use another Kirby Smart cliche, keep the main thing, living life to the fullest, enjoying every step of that. It ought to be inspiring to all of us, and it's the kind of thing that I do think really, and it's hard to say this without it sounding just, you know, kind of trite, but it really is the way that life is supposed to be lived, and I think there is something to be learned by watching people just soak up every moment of life and maintain a spirit of gratitude. That's the kind of thing that we can very easily forget about because of some of the petty things that we worry about from time to time. What a stark reminder that some of the folks that you had a chance to interact with yesterday can provide.
No doubt. And watching the Georgia players interact was also impressive. You know, they're out there. They're volunteering. They didn't have to go out there. I think there were 54 guys that went out there. One, it was interesting to see which players chose to go out there, who was there, and then to watch them interact. And let me tell you, when they played that dodgeball game, and there's a short video in the story, they weren't holding back. I mean, those kids. But those balls were going 60 miles an hour. I mean, that was a honest-to-goodness, real-life dodgeball game, and it didn't matter who had what. And the kids loved it. Excuse me, Dave. They absolutely loved it. They got James Cook's best, okay, and Tyreek Stevenson. And I mean, and let me tell you, it was fun watching those guys out there and their athleticism. Watching, I mean, the way that Tyreek and Cook are. I'm thinking to myself, these are two of the fastest, quickest human beings on the planet right now, playing dodgeball right in front of me. Seriously, if you were to play an honest-to-goodness world dodgeball tournament, these would be two of the best when you look at Cook's quickness and change of directions. And all I can say about Tyreek Stevens, I can see why they call him Tyreek the Freak. I mean, the guys had an impromptu dunk session yesterday. It was quite a show, and the kids were right in the middle of it. I mean, that, like I said, that dodgeball game was real, and it was fun to watch. And some of the kids even hit some of the players. The players weren't looking, or they'd get distracted with one another. I mean, it was on, and it was fun.
Yeah, that's really great to hear, Mike. I appreciate those stories. Let me say one more thing about this before we kind of change the subject. You know, there is a way to be cynical about everything, and I'm sure for some there's maybe even a way to be cynical about this and say, oh, well, this is just good publicity for the Georgia football team. I would counter that, though, Mike, by saying that what this really is good publicity for the camp itself. You know, Georgia football has an incredible brand, incredible cachet, and anything that the Georgia team does is going to get a lot of notice, a lot of attention. When Kirby Smart and these Georgia players choose to be at this place, the media is going to follow, yourself included. It would not surprise me at all to find out that Georgia's appearance at Camp Sunshine and for the Camp Twin Lakes facility overall, which hosts a lot of different camps, I've been there, I've seen it with my own eyes, it would not surprise me to find out that appearance from Georgia yesterday is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to that facility that could not operate without the generous donations of the people who have just noticed it and paid attention to it. There are a lot of things that people can be benevolent towards, a lot of ways for philanthropic dollars to be spent. This is an attention game, and Georgia using its fame to give attention to Camp Sunshine yesterday. I really think that's an incredibly generous act on the part of this football program, Kirby Smart included.
Well, I mean, it's personal for Kirby. His brother went through it, and Kirby's family benefited from social funds as his brother was going through it, and now it's Kirby's program, and he, like I said, he doesn't make those players go out there. They go out there on their own. They know it means a lot to their football coach, and Kirby means a lot to them, right? But then once they go out there, and there's a video, Charlie Warner talks about it, how when he went out there as a freshman, I mean, yes, we're all, listening, watching, oh, yes, we know there's people with cancer, we know they're out there, but until you're in the middle of it, until you're in the middle of Camp Sunshine, until you're in the midst of the people, and you're meeting them, and you're shaking their hand, and you're hearing their stories, you're taking their time to hear their testimony, it's different. It's like traveling somewhere. It's like, oh yeah, I know that there's snow up north. Well, until you're in a snowstorm, until you're in the blizzard, you don't really understand what it's really all about. And I would say the same for this camp. And so from the publicity, I would agree with you. I mean, yes, they raised $295,000 yesterday because of a race that was held there. Kirby's foundation gives to this. Obviously, his family's been touched by it. Because when there's one person with cancer in the family, it affects the whole family. It affects the whole community, for that matter. So in the sense of, yes, fundraising, but also from an educational standpoint, Jake Fromm had a great quote. He said, you put days like this in the memory bank, and it helps you get through the tough days. It puts things in perspective, and it makes you realize how fortunate you are that you don't have to overcome some of the things that these young people are dealing with or had to overcome in their life. They're, 13, 8, 15 years old. So I thought Fromm put it into perspective. It's just a win-win all the way around, and I can't believe anyone would, find any reason to be cynical about it. Listen, Georgia's football image doesn't need any help. It is what it is. It's the biggest, it's the best in the Southeastern Conference. The power of the G is a global brand. Everybody knows what Georgia's all about. This is more personal. This is more about helping families and educating young people and giving them a really valuable perspective, BA, because, it's like when you're on that scary plane flight, right? How many of us have been on that flight and you say, oh, my gosh, I said my prayers, and it kind of puts things into perspective quickly. And so I think it's as educational, and I think it's as much about the families as it is anything else.
Let me talk to you about a couple football-related things here before we let you go. One of the things we made a big deal in our show about yesterday was a comment that David Pollack, the former UGA great, gave to you about the Georgia defense and his challenge, so to speak, for the group to be more dominant in 2019. And, Mike, the point I made yesterday was if you go back and look at Kirby Smart's defenses the last couple of years, it's safe to say that these defenses have stopped short of being dominant in both of the last 2 years. Georgia's only been in the top 10 in one major category, really in any regard, the last 2 seasons when they were, I think, 6th in the country in points allowed in 2017. Otherwise, we're talking about top 12, top 15 type stuff. The advanced metrics kind of tell a similar story and all of that. I believe this program's recruited enough now where there's an upgrade in talent compared to previous years. But do you, based on what you saw this spring and the conversations you've had, do you believe this group now has the kind of talent necessary, to use Pollack's word, and go out and dominate as a defense this season?
Yeah, there's more talent, especially on the back end. And really the most telling comments I got about this DA were from Mel Tucker. When DawgNation went out there, I went out there to cover the national championship game, and Mel Tucker spoke out there, and he was telling me that a lot of the things that he and Kirby put in for the defense early on and in these first few years were out of necessity. Okay, they wanted to do more. But like any good coaching staff, you've got to play to your talent. And that's not to say that Mark Richt didn't have talent. Obviously he had talent. He had the SEC Defensive Player of the Year, Roquan Smith. But it was recruited slightly differently, right? It was a machine, but the machine was put together, a Mercedes and a BMW. They're put together a little differently. There's great engineering in both. But now Kirby's been able to recruit the players and the parts that fit his system, to your point. And so, yes, we are going to see the Georgia defense continue to evolve. And, yes, a lot of what they were doing before defensively was out of necessity. And so what Kirby did, which I thought was brilliant, the thing that gets overlooked that I want to keep bringing up, it's so important, and I don't have the exact exact numbers here in front of me, BA, but, Kirby knew that he wasn't going to have the most sacks and the most TFLs. He didn't have that type of front seven to work with these last 2 years. So he said, okay, we're going to make sure we don't give up the big play. Yeah. And if you go back and look, Georgia gave up the fewest plays over 25 yards of any team in the country. And it was like a staggering number. It was like Georgia gave up like 23 plays over 25 yards, and like Florida and LSU gave up 58. I mean, you did not beat Georgia with one play. It was very hard to beat Georgia for a big gain of over 20 yards. You had to sustain. You had to execute. You had to avoid turnovers. You had to convert third downs. It took what LSU did, 4 fourth-down conversions, to make the Georgia defense not look good. Okay, the odds are against. I don't think we'll ever see a team ever go 4 for 4 on fourth down against Kirby Smart again in his entire career. What else? And give LSU credit, and it was a unique situation. They were all very short, but that was what broke Georgia's back. That's what it took to break Georgia's back last year, even though they did not have a dominant defense. And in the end, what it took was Deandre Walker going down and then not having a qualified backup. Brenton Cox was not ready. He had still not learned his lesson about contain. Walker tried to help him with it earlier in the year. We all remember that exchange where he pushed him and Cox erupted like a young person does at times. And I asked somebody after the game, he said, yeah, kid wasn't containing. It was against MTSU. They converted some third downs. And so, that freshman was not ready for the moment against Alabama. That's not going to happen moving forward. There's going to be more depth, to your point, BA. So, yes, I do think we're going to see more dominant numbers, but I don't want to undersell what Kirby was able to do last year, even without the type of personnel that he really wanted and needed to run what he wants to do.
Let me squeeze in one final thing before we let you go. I talked running backs before you joined us, and the point that I made was some of the national media expect Deandre Swift to get significantly more carries this season than he had a year ago, but the story in 2017 would suggest that's not necessarily the case. Nick Chubb had one game with 20 carries in 2017, but he or Sonny Michel didn't have that many carries in any other game that season. 2018, kind of a similar story, although Swift was somewhat hobbled by the groin injury. My expectation is there's more of a balanced situation when it comes to the Georgia running backs this year, and Swift probably finished the season with fewer carries than some national writers that maybe don't know the program quite as well might expect. Where would you land on a conversation like that?
Yeah, I think more touches, not a ton more touches, but more touches, because I think they're going to throw to the backside of the backfield, and I think Swift can really hurt you in that way. And what that does is it neutralizes the blitz. It neutralizes the rush. And right now with Georgia's quarterback situation the way it is, you really got to protect Jake. As it was, Jake got hit fewer times than any quarterback in the SEC last year. That's documented. He'll get hit even less this year, not just because of the great protection and the great offensive line and the strong run game that's going to put Georgia in positive down and distance situations, but also because his ability to throw the ball to the running backs. And I think Swift's going to be a big part of that. There were some games early on, and unbeknownst to us, Deandre told me after the season that he had actually hurt his foot against South Carolina. So in addition to the groin, there was a foot injury against South Carolina that we didn't even know about at the time. We did know that he had limited carries against MTSU, and Kirby kind of played that off at the time. But, DeAndre Swift really wasn't healthy until that foot had time to rest during the bye week LSU game. And then you saw what he did in November. He was unbelievable in November. I mean, he looked as good as any running back. In fact, Georgia football was playing as good as any team in the country in the month of November. And teams ebb and flow. Some programs don't understand that. Clemson likes to believe they were just as good in September as January. It's kind of ridiculous. But teams do ebb and flow. And when Swift was at his best, Georgia was at their best. And right now, we've got a healthy Swift. He was out there yesterday. I was watching him closely. And he looked good. I mean, he looks really solid. Cut, moving around well. I mean, he was out there on the basketball court. I mean, he was moving very well. Swift is he's primed and ready. And so I don't know from a number standpoint, but I do think you're going to see more of DeAndre Swift on top 10 plays of the day. I think you're going to see him hit more home runs because he's had a completely healthy offseason. And to your point, I think we're going to see Brian Herrien. I think we're going to see James Cook. And we'll see Samir White's carries increase as the year goes on, and who knows about Kenny McIntosh. But I do think we'll see more Swift highlights. So it may appear that he's getting more work, only because I expect him to have more big plays.
I think it's a really interesting point, Mike, and a great way to finish up our conversation. We'll look forward to reading a bunch more from you at DawgNation.com in the days ahead. We appreciate your coverage from Rutledge, Georgia yesterday, and we'll also enjoy speaking to you here on DawgNation Daily again very soon, too.
Thanks, B. I appreciate it, man.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So Mike said two things right there that I think are really important to bring up. One is more serious, one is completely unserious, and yet I think also very fun. First of all, on the subject of Deandre Swift, we have been in the TV era for a Heisman candidates for a long time. I'm a child of kind of the 90s. That's when I really came into my own as a college football fan, late 80s, early 90s. And back then, it's, who made ESPN. That's who got that Heisman attention. Did you get featured on the show where, the late-night college football scoreboard show, and if you did, you're kind of in that Heisman conversation. I think the highlight world now, though, is a little bit less about TV and a little bit more about Twitter. The stuff that gets tweeted out, the stuff that gets shared on social media. And I think even with a limited number of carries, because Swift is kind of a spectacular player, because he does have a little bit of a flair for the dramatic with the way that he runs the ball, I think that he could potentially get enough highlights even with limited carries, and I mean limited in comparison to Jonathan Taylor, who Wisconsin's just going to wear down to the nub. I think that Swift can kind of stay in that conversation among running backs because of the highlight way in which he runs. Go back and watch the Alabama game as an instance, for instance, on this. Go back and watch the Kentucky game as a for instance on this. Now, I know that J.J. Holloman was ear-holing some would-be tacklers that opened up Swift on some of that kind of stuff, but Swift still has kind of a spectacular run. I think Mike's right about that his highlights will tell the story, even in comparison to probably less prolific numbers. Jonathan Taylor had, I think, 2,000 yards a year ago. I mean, Wisconsin will just wear its running backs out. Georgia, by comparison's simply not going to do that. The other thing that Mike brings up, and I'll be quick on this, but I think it's worth pointing out because I think it's funny. If dodgeball was an Olympic sport, and Georgia yesterday, dodgeball is kind of one of the traditions as part of the Camp Sunshine deal there at Camp Twin Lakes in Rutledge, Georgia. They always seem to play dodgeball. If dodgeball was an Olympic sport, some of the guys that Mike mentioned, a James Cook and some of those others, Tyreek Stevenson, maybe DeAndre Swift as well. If you're going to put together like the 12 best Olympic-level dodgeball players, I would think that a couple of Georgia players would have to at least be candidates in that. Now, I don't know how much service time they have in trying to become dodgeball players, but my guess is some of those guys would be pretty good in the dodgeball realm of things if they ever choose to get real serious about it. Of course, if you, read some of the studies as of late, maybe that's also kind of an oppressive bullying type sport now. But nonetheless, if dodgeball's still sanctioned in 10 or 15 years, some of these Georgia guys would probably be pretty good Olympic-style athletes when it came to that. I think that's a pretty good point for Mike. Now, before we do the SEC through, let me tell you about my friends at Kroger here for a moment, which today launches a Kroger Fuel VIP program that allows customers to earn 2 fuel points on purchases instead of just one. So that's a great new upgrade there from our friends at Kroger. Really good stuff. Enrollment is also super easy. You can scan the barcode at checkout, or you can enroll online. Let me give the website here. It's Kroger.com/fuel VIP. Now, credit to you if you can spell fuel right on the first try. It's FUEL. Kroger.com/fuel VIP. Annual enrollment is just $40, and it's well worth it because you get 2 fuel points for every $1 spent. That's a great deal from our friends at Kroger, and I wanted to make sure you were aware of that today. All right, to start off our SEC through, I want to say something, and I know this is going to come across like propaganda, but I think I'm more right than wrong on this. Longtime Tuscaloosa News columnist Cecil Hurt was on the Paul Feinbaum show this week. I don't know if we have this screen grab, this tweet or not from the Feinbaum show about that, but what Cecil Hurt essentially said was, here's the quote, and I think this is very interesting. Cecil Hurt knows the program. He's been in Tuscaloosa seemingly forever. He says on Feinbaum, Nick Saban has probably spent more time this summer thinking about a team that's not on the schedule officially than about anybody who are. That's a reference to the situation at Clemson, because Clemson just beat Alabama badly in the national championship game a year ago. Now, here's my point, and this is going to come across like propaganda, and yet I believe I'm right about this. If Alabama really is obsessed with Clemson, as Cecil Hurt suggests they are, I think that's a huge opportunity for Georgia. I do. because it almost comes across as if Alabama thinks Georgia's in its rearview mirror because it's beaten them 2 years in a row. Yet anybody who watched those games knows how razor thin the margin in both of them were. Credit to Alabama, they were on the right side of that edge, but nonetheless, these were incredibly close games, and Georgia, from a recruiting standpoint, from an on-field standpoint, it's proven that it's incredibly close to winning. So if Alabama's that obsessed with Clemson, they may get snuck up on by Georgia before they realize. Now, it's fair to point out, somebody who's not a Georgia fan may say, yeah, well, BA, the same thing could happen for Georgia as well. It's obsessed with Alabama right now. Y'all talk about Alabama every day on DawgNation Daily. That's what an Alabama fan might say. What about somebody sneaking up on Georgia? Here's where I think that situation's a little bit different. The teams that would be most likely to sneak up on Georgia, a team like Florida, y'all, they're not sneaking. They're loud as they can be. Noisy, obnoxious, as you might expect Gators fans to be, making a big ruckus. And, Kirby Smart has said over and over again in response to this, he meaning his team, we are going to do our talking with our helmets. So there is no Florida sneak up on Georgia here because Florida has been loud, obnoxious, and kind of, overrating itself for the entirety of the offseason. So Florida will get Georgia's full attention come the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. And a program like Auburn, who might be a little more of a quiet offseason, I've been telling you all since the winter that I thought that Auburn was Georgia's most dangerous game. So to the extent that my microphone holds any sway or influence whatsoever, I've been touting Auburn as a dangerous game there for a while. Teams like, say, Tennessee or South Carolina or somebody like that, honestly, they are not a threat to Georgia yet because they don't have enough talent to do that. But I think that the would-be sneak-ups on Georgia are a lot more difficult to conjure up than the idea that Georgia could sneak up on Alabama while it's heavily focused on Clemson. Y'all watch and see if this happens. If it is true that Alabama is that singularly focused and obsessed with Clemson, that is bad news for them come first Saturday in December if they even make the game. One more SEC through story I want to get to here. I mentioned off the top of the show USA Today's ranking of its top running backs in college football. Deandre Swift came in at number 3 on that list. Believe it or not, there was only one other SEC running back on the entire list. It seems a little atypical for the SEC to only have those running backs. Najee Harris was listed as kind of an also-ran, almost made the top 10 from Alabama. But the other SEC back who made the list is Keyshawn Vaughn from Vanderbilt. Now, I will admit that Vaughn kind of sneaks up on me just a little bit. But when you go back and look at his numbers, what a performance for him late in the season a year ago, including a huge, huge game in that wild bowl game that Vanderbilt played against Baylor. So, here's what I think is interesting. When Georgia does play Vanderbilt to start the season, one of the tests that we've had for Georgia in 2019, can it be better with its rush defense? Not great at that a year ago. If it's a dominant defense this season, it's going to prove that by shutting down the run. Well, what better opportunity to prove that than in week 1 on the road against someone that USA Today calls one of the top 10 running backs in the country? That's a pretty good measuring stick for the Georgia defense, and all of a sudden week 1 versus Vanderbilt gets a whole lot more fun. We will make that your SEC throw. And before I start taking some of your questions and comments, let me remind you of my friends at Online Trading Academy. Investing is one of the most important things that you can do, and the best overall decision you can make when it comes to investing. Step 1 is to invest in yourself. That means learning about how the markets work. That's where Online Trading Academy comes in, both in the classroom and online, through a variety of trading styles, a spectrum of asset classes. Find them online at tradingacademy.com/Atlanta. I always speak fast, so I want to make sure you're aware. That's trading with a D, tradingacademy.com/Atlanta. Check out Online Trading Academy today. All right, as a part of our program, we've been doing this for the most part during the summer. Your questions and comments, we'll do some of that right now. And, of course, we'll do even more of those as a part of our R.S. Andrews cool down a little bit later on in the show today. Let me pull up a few of these and we'll kind of get rocking and rolling. I am curious to hear your thoughts about DeAndre Swift, what I started the show with, about what the balance of rushing attacks will look like for Georgia this season, and in comparison to Clemson, that actually had probably a more balanced rushing attack a year ago than I realized, the importance of Brian Herring, the importance of Samir White, I think they're greatly magnified here this season. And then something else I hope that you'll take time to weigh in on as a part of our comment section today. Jeff reporting that Tank Bigsby was taking an unofficial visit to Georgia yesterday. I've been of the belief that Bigsby, because he's an in-state back, is a popular recruit right now. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of how you think Bigsby could potentially fit into Georgia, his willingness to maybe be a part of a tandem, or just how he stands on his own in comparison to some of the top backs in the country. I'd love to hear from you on that. Matt Rukavina, how about this? On the subject of those secondary running backs for Georgia, those complimentary backs, he said that Samir White runs for 200 yards against Florida. Talk about a happy edition of our post-game show from the field there in Jacksonville. And obviously it's interesting to think about that against, Georgia's hated, bitter rival in Florida. But it's also interesting to think about how much better White could be near the end of the season than he might be at the beginning. I do think, even if he's fully cleared to practice, and Kirby Smart has kind of said that he would be, I think we'll see more and better of Samir over the course of the season than we will early in September. I don't think Georgia really needs him at all until week 4 against Notre Dame. They might not even need him then, depending on what the Irish might be like. But as the season goes on, I do think they're going to take that toy out for a spin. And my guess is, sometime around that Florida game, we see the best of Samir White. And if it really popped there against the Gators, I'd be plenty happy about that. We'll take more of your comments coming up as part of our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. We do that every day here on DawgNation Daily on our video channels. And, for those of you who have been saying, well, I don't get a chance to watch the show live, I'd like to interact with you. I think the best way to do that is probably reaching out on Twitter at DawgNation Daily. I love the sort of back and forth interaction we're able to have there on Twitter. I try to respond to everything that I get. So please reach out to me at DawgNation Daily on Twitter. We can kind of keep that conversation going. And by the way, speaking of those lousy, stinking Gators, it seems like a good enough time to remind you it has now been 962 days since Florida's beaten Georgia. That's a number that we think keeps going up for a while, and no, we don't think, as I mentioned before, that Florida's going to do any sneaking up on Georgia this year. Unfortunately for Florida, they've got Georgia's full attention. I think that Georgia comes in ready to steamroll in Jacksonville later on. It's our Gator Hater Updater. We love doing that. We'll see you DawgNation Days of Summer coming up in August at Brasstown, and back here tomorrow on DawgNation Daily. And on a video, time now for our R.S. Andrews Cool Down, where we get a chance to take as many of your comments as we can on any subject you want. I have not been doing an official sanctioned Q&A as of late, just because, as I said before, y'all kind of like to talk about whatever you talk about anyway. So I would like your thoughts about the dodgeball thing, though. If you want to kind of weigh in and let me know who do you think among the Georgia players will be the best dodgeball player, you can kind of do that. We can have a little fun with that here today as well. Connor yesterday wrote some really good either-or scenarios for Georgia. Maybe we'll get into some of that. We ended up talking a bunch yesterday about the gunshot thing, which is sort of a weird thing to say out of context. But maybe we can get into that a little bit. I'd love your thoughts on, as I said, Bigsby, Swift, the other backs, kind of anything that you want to do as a part of our program here today. Let's take as many of your comments now as we can. I'll start on Facebook, then go over to YouTube after that. On the subject, Jarvis Hanna says, BA, the Georgia running game will be number one in the running game by the end of the season. And I do think that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. And I'm one of those guys that doesn't really care about the total yards amassed, by comparison. There's almost no chance that Georgia gets as many rushing yards as Army, for instance. But that doesn't matter to me. Yards per carry do matter a lot. Running the ball when you really need to, that matters to me a lot. And, I mentioned the Clemson situation before where, as I said, going and look at the numbers, a guy like Lynn J. Dixon was much, much better for Clemson last year than I realized, and he probably gets more carries this year than he got a year ago. So that's going to be kind of like their, DeAndre Swift, Samir White tandem, or DeAndre Swift, Brian Herrien tandem is going to be Etienne and Lynn J. there in that regard. Clemson also recruited a back this year, although admittedly I don't know as much about him. But you look at Alabama, which lost a lot of running backs a year ago. All of a sudden, now it's Najee Harris in more of a feature role than he's been before. But Najee's a little hard to figure out, does he like being in Tuscaloosa? Is he ready for that full load? Brian Robinson's a kid from Tuscaloosa. At one point in time was like top 100 recruit in the country, but has, not gotten on the field for Alabama before. He's been kind of biding his time. That may be their own version of kind of an Elijah Holyfield. But, as it stands right now, Alabama matching what Georgia has, the running back position, I think it's a little bit difficult to do. Now, you should also probably point out here that Trey Sanders said he's going to win the Heisman Trophy. So maybe you got to factor that into the discussion there a bit as well. But when it comes to having the best running backs, I don't need Georgia to have the most rushing yards because in all likelihood, the team that collects the most rushing yards is not necessarily competing for a national championship. But when it comes to like yards per carry stuff and things like that, I do need for the Georgia guys to be probably superior to what Clemson's going to be able to produce, and probably superior to what Alabama is going to be able to produce. I think that's important. By the way, one more point, and this is kind of only tangentially related to this. We'll probably talk more about this tomorrow. I saw where Pro Football Focus has put out its preseason top 25, and interestingly enough, they do not have Georgia number 3. They have Georgia number 4, ranked behind LSU. We may dive a little deeper into that tomorrow. I thought that was kind of an interesting point to bring up. Let me get some more Facebook comments. Justin Dow on the subject of Trey Sanders. It sounds like he thinks he's going to be involved in the Alabama offense. We shall see. That's one that a lot of Georgia fans think kind of got away. Shane Guy says, I'm looking forward to letting Zeus loose. And Shane, I would agree with you on that. I think it's also interesting because of some of the stuff that Kendall Milton has said as of late. Milton expects DeAndre Swift to be gone and expects himself to be either the number 1 or number 2 running back for Georgia next year, where he do sign with Georgia, of course. I have to add as the caveat, he's thinking about himself in that role, as anybody would when they take a visit. And I'm assuming that his 1 or 2 that he's thinking about is Samir White. So that becomes kind of interesting to think about in terms of what White may show this year as far as maybe an expanded role, I think, even in a year from now. Ro Hawkins says, I think that D-Rob would be a good dodgeball player. I got to say, I think that Demetrius Robertson would be a good dodgeball player because he can catch. I think that's, you play the game where if somebody throws at you and you catch it, you basically get them out, right? In team dodgeball, that's where that works, right? So he can catch. He'd be able to do that. And I just think he'd be awful hard to hit. I just do. He's lightning fast, but, a good bit of lateral stuff as well. I think Demetrius Robertson would be very, very hard to hit with a dodgeball. I think that's probably a pretty good answer. Shannon Baker says the offensive line is going to part the seas for our running back. And Shannon, it's interesting that you bring that up because I was kind of thinking about the same thing too. So I'm going to be seemingly greedy about something for a moment. But I do have a little bit of a concern for next season. If, DeAndre Swift leaves, almost certainly he will. Let's say that Georgia signs Kendall Milton, but let's say it doesn't sign another elite back. So now you've got what you think of as what Milton himself described, the 1-2 punch of Milton and Samir White. And that's the kind of thing that most schools can only dream about. That seems like a really, really good tandem. But Samir White has been injured in each of the last 2 years. Kendall Milton himself will only be a freshman. Kenny McIntosh, James Cook, right now, they're kind of unproven commodities as well. Is that enough elite running backs to do what Georgia wants to do, to be what Georgia wants to be? And then I guess the potential response to that is what Shannon said. But BA, you got to think about the offensive line. Now, even next season, if you lose 4 offensive linemen off the 2019 roster, you're still talking about one of the deepest and best offensive lines in the country, with guys like Jamari Salyer and Cade Mays likely sliding into the starting lineup to go with whatever else Georgia has there. But I still find myself kind of asking the question, what if Georgia doesn't get the second complimentary back to what I'm going to at least assume for the moment might end up being Kendall Milton? Is that enough? Does that give Georgia enough for 2020 to stay as strong as it has been at the running back position? I think it's a fair question to ask. Let me go over to YouTube for a moment. We'll get some thoughts over there about what folks have going on here today. I apologize for not always already having these pulled up, but we're going to take care of some of that right now. And hope the folks in YouTube are kind of having a blast like always, no doubt. Chevron Hannah said, what did I miss? Chevron, always a ton of fun when you're not here. So you missed out on a good bit. Crow King 123 says on the subject of what Georgia could have for 2020, he says, I'm a big believer in Kenny McIntosh. And that's a fair response to that question. Somebody who says, I've seen McIntosh. I saw what he did there in South Florida as a high school player, the big body, the strength. I like him. And that's a very reasonable response. It's also reasonable to say that much the same way Elijah Holyfield broke out in 2018, we assume that Brian Herrion's going to break out in 2019, and I feel like that's pretty close to a given. I'm just of a strong assumption that will happen. It's fair to say, well, in 2020, it'll be James Cook's turn to do the same thing, and that'll be the kind of the next waiting in the wings elite back for Georgia. That might also be a fair response into all of that. G. Grace says it's peaceful over here today. Well, G. Grace, if it's peaceful, I'm going to credit you with that because you seem to be the one that's always stirring up the trouble. So thank you very much for keeping the peace over there for us on the YouTube side of things here today. And I'm obviously just kidding, Grace. We're always glad to have you. Danny Blackman says that Swift is better than Etienne. I don't have a strong opinion on that one way or another. I think that both Swift and Etienne have been good in big games. Etienne had, I believe, 2 touchdowns against Alabama a year ago. He went off against Pitt in the ACC title game, to the extent that you think of that as even being a big game. So I'll be curious to see that side-by-side comparison. I don't have a real strong argument on that one way or another. I think they're both good backs. The lead Georgia boy says today in YouTube kind of reminds me of the old days if Saquad was gone. I'm telling y'all shouldn't let these guys get you started up quite so much. They're just trying to pull your chain. The Green Soldier says that McIntosh is another good back. What do you see from Herring BA overall production, more between the tackles? So when it comes to Herring, I just think he's good. I just think that he's capable of doing almost anything. And I think that admittedly on a show like this, listen, I've got a hype gene, right? I mean, I've always had that natural tendency to kind of hype things up and gravitate towards where the hype is. I mean, I just speak into a microphone for a living. You can't sit in a studio like this without being at least a little bit attracted to hype. And Herring did not have as much of that for whatever reason. I still don't quite understand why so many people in the recruiting trail didn't really know who he was, because his first game against North Carolina, he just was good. And his most recent game against Texas, he kind of looked the part there as well. My assumption is he's just a good back, and he's going to have the kind of good season that a good Georgia running back would have. What you saw last year from Elijah Holyfield, even though he's probably a slightly different back than Holyfield, that level of production, I think the door is open for that kind of thing from Herring this year, and will probably always gravitate more towards the former number 1 back Samir White, or former 5-star DeAndre Swift, or future versions of those players like Kendall Milton will probably always around here end up getting into the orbit of some of those other players. But Brian Herring's just good. And Brian Herring could have left and probably gone somewhere else and, gotten 30 carries a game or something like that. But he chose to stay here at Georgia. And I think he's going to be rewarded for it. I think he should be. Really glad for Herring and the opportunity he's about to get. Now, I also think that there are going to be plenty of carries to go around for Samir White, and obviously, as we said before, plenty for DeAndre Swift as well. But I believe that Herring's going to get his chance here this season. Let me see what Elijah Hardison has to say. He says, I think everyone is forgetting about Cook. He has good agility and home run speed with some college experience under his belt now. Just had to work on ball security, which I'm sure is being addressed. So, Elijah, here's my thing on James. Back during the spring, had a chance to ask Kirby Smart, or one of us asked Kirby Smart, about James Cook, and what Kirby said is that Cook was not really 100% healthy during the spring. He was dealing with a little bit of an ankle injury. So I will admit, as it stands right now, I don't know what Georgia has in Cook, but there's a very good chance. He's Dalvin Cook's brother. He was a former elite recruit. He's fast as lightning. He's the kind of athlete that could potentially even play like a slot receiver type deal. There's a chance that Georgia has a lot, and once he's not hobbled by any kind of injury whatsoever, if he's truly, fully 100% healthy, he could emerge and bust on the scene. I don't see a scenario this year where Cook becomes one of Georgia's top 3 backs unless something were to happen for the negative with one of those backs, like an injury. Barring that, I think the top 3 is fairly well set in stone. Do I think that Cook could be ahead of Kenny McIntosh? In all likelihood, I assume that's probably true. But my guess is there's a gap between Samir, Herring, and Swift and James Cook. And you say, well, you haven't seen Samir White. What would you base that on? Y'all, there's just too much whisper. There's just too much conjecture around Samir, both before he got hurt in August and then kind of since then. You get the sense that he's healthy. We've heard plenty of people saying that here on DawgNation Daily, kind of both on and off the record. So I feel like Samir White is in that group of guys who are going to get a lot of carries. The fact that Milton made kind of a veiled reference to him means something to me as well. So I think for now, Cook is still behind those other 3. But listen, in 2017, we got a decent number of carries, or we got a chance to see a decent number of carries for Herring and Holyfield that year as number 4, number 5 type backs. There was at least one game in particular where 4 backs got carries in the first quarter of a game. I think it was maybe I forget who it was against, but Georgia even got a 4th and 5th back somewhat involved in 2017. So we may see a glimpse of Cook this year, even if he's not one of the top 3 guys. Looks like Connor Riley's ready to join us here today as well.
Yeah, Cook, I'll be interested to see how Georgia sort of uses him this year because, given his size and just seeing him out there on the practice field, he is not as physically big as some of the other Georgia running backs.
Smaller back, for sure.
Certainly even compared to DeAndre Swift, who's sort of thought to be in a similar mold. So I wonder how much they're going to split him out and set him out at wide receiver. But to go back to something you said earlier, if Georgia gets Kendall Milton and they have Samir White and they have James Cook and they have Brian Herrien, they're going to be more than fine.
But they won't have Herrien, though.
Or Kenny McIntosh.
Yeah, you're right.
They're going to be more than fine.
You think that's enough elite backs?
I think that's plenty of elite backs.
Because but here's
2 5-stars, the top 40 overall, number 41 running back, along with a number 10 running back in his high school class.
But here's the thing, though, and you're probably right, but here's my pushback on that. We haven't seen McIntosh at all, and we really haven't seen James Cook in any moments to speak of. Late in the season a little bit, but he didn't play a ton until late in the season. I mean, I'm very, very comfortable in right now saying I don't know what Georgia has in McIntosh or Cook. They may have 2 great backs. A lot of folks in this on our program right now are heavily vouching for them. I take that seriously. But to me, if it's enough, it's just enough. It's not like last year was, going to the 2018 season, where you said, hey, your number 3 back might be Samir White, something along those lines. It's not that level of depth. It's not.
I mean, okay, but to your point about we haven't seen anything from McIntosh or Cook, what are we going to have seen from, theoretically, Zachary Evans or Tank Bigsby?
They're just, in the case of Evans, for sure, they're just better overall recruits.
But that doesn't equate to them being better overall players.
If you gave me a blind taste test, I'll take the better overall recruit. I just will.
Okay, and then you wouldn't have Brian Herrien.
Well, it's not always going to work out that way, but if you give me the overall choice, I would feel the same way with Samir White a year ago. Samir White as an unproven commodity going into his freshman season, as what at the time kind of looked like Georgia's maybe number 3 back or so, because he was the nation's number 1 back coming out of high school. I think people felt pretty good about that. I think the overall feeling, with all due respect to McIntosh and Cook, unless we see a lot from them this season or see glimpses from them this season, it's not going to be the same level of competence as an unknown commodity like Samir would have been going to last season.
I just think it goes back to what Jeff Sentell said. You'd trade it all in just for a little bit.
That's fine, but on this one, I do feel like I'm not exaggerating this. I think it's just enough. I don't think it's an embarrassment. It's not an embarrassment of riches.
Georgia can go out and bring it. With Dijon Edwards out of Colquitt County, he's not, he's still a 4-star running back. Would that qualify as the quote-unquote elite back for you?
So here's what I'll tell you. Another body would be, of a certain threshold, another body would be great. Whether it's Bijan, whether it's Tank Bigsby. I said it's Bijan, right?
No, it's Dijon.
Dijon, excuse me.
Like the mustard.
It's whether it's Tank Bigsby, whether it's whomever, another body to kind of go in that discussion would make me feel a lot better because, listen, when it comes to all this stuff, I play the odds. As I've told y'all before, I'm not into individual evaluations. I'm not into mine. I'm not into yours. I'm not into anybody's. I don't care what anybody thinks about an individual player evaluation. But if you give me enough of a collection of would-be breakout stars, I'm going to trust the math that a couple of them do break out. That's just the way this stuff works. It just does over and over again.
Will on Facebook, BA wants to have 100 backs in the backfield. I think 100 would do it for BA.
But here's why, and I'll move off this topic after this. Here's why this matters to me more than anything else. It goes back to the philosophy that I bring up from time to time, that the recipe for success in football is making sure your number 1 strength stays strong. It's not always about correcting your biggest weakness. It's about ensuring that your number 1 strength stays strong. And if Georgia goes into a 2020 situation, an injury away from not having 2 dynamic elite backs to turn to, then on paper the appearance would be that the strength is not as strong as it has been in previous years.
Well, all right, so if Georgia does go out and sign a second running back, are you okay with them? Because the numbers in this class are going to be tight. Are you okay with that, meaning, you get 1 potential fewer defensive tackle, 1 fewer potential defensive back, 1 fewer potential offensive lineman? And I would say when it comes to the defensive backfield and the offensive line, those strengths this year are going to be just as strong, if not stronger, than what Georgia has in the running back.
So I believe, I think that's a very fair question. It's a good question. I believe that I would take the extra back right now.
Okay.
The extra back for me is a priority. Now, if you want to do the math and say, no, here's why that's not true, I'm willing to listen to a counter argument. But for me, I'll take the extra back. Let's do something else. Anybody else got anything else going on in the comment section here?
Yesterday was the 15-year anniversary of Average Joe's Gym's classic comeback against Globo Gym. They were down 4 men to 1.
Hold on.
4 players to 1.
Hold on. Before you finish this. So are you telling me that the dodgeball game for Georgia came on the anniversary of Dodgeball, the movie?
15 years.
That is amazing.
15
that makes me
years
happier than anything could possibly all day today.
15 years to the day. Nobody makes Dwight Goodman bleed his own blood. Or White Goodman, excuse me.
Dwight Goodman was almost a Mets pitcher back when I was a kid. That is amazing. So with that in mind, who's the best dodgeball player on the Georgia roster in your mind?
Dominic Blaylock. Great. He's a great athlete.
Probably pretty good.
Great athlete, baseball player, good with his hands, obviously. And I think the other important thing to remember here is you want guys that don't have big target radiuses. Smaller guys are harder to hit. They're a little bit more agile. That's why maybe someone like George Pickens, I don't know how much I'd want him on my team because, while, yes, he'd be good at catching. He's not exactly the fleetest of foot guys, and he's got a little bit of a bigger
taller
target
guys are a disadvantage in dodgeball. And the one thing, because we've got some really cool highlights of Dominic Blaylock we personally have possession of here. We've shown you before. We've seen that thing from him where he does the step and turns on a toe. That's a dodgeball skill right there. So I do think he'd be really good. Another guy that kind of does that turn on a dime thing is Swift. I think he's a low center of gravity. Yep. Deandre Swift has got to be an exceptional. Now, I saw a video of him yesterday playing basketball. One of the reporters tweeted out he was hooping it up pretty good. But as a dodgeball player, my guess is Swift can catch it. He can turn. He kind of has that low center shiftiness. My guess is that Deandre is a pretty good dodgeball player as well.
Mm-hmm. I would think so. I think you have to mention Jake Fromm in there just because of the arm.
Yeah.
I think
accurate.
Accurate. If he's not going to be the guy that's running up there to get the balls at the start of the game, but he's a guy you're going to toss a ball to, and you expect him to take out 2 to 3 guys on the opposing.
Here's an interesting name. Dog Life on YouTube says he'd take Nolan Smith in dodgeball. Now, I think that Nolan is kind of big, which makes him a little easier to hit. I don't know how well he catches. I'm sure he's probably plenty capable of catching the ball. But here's the one thing where a guy like Nolan would probably be a valuable asset. When it comes to like playground games, kickball, dodgeball, things like that, my guess is that Nolan's pretty competitive.
Yep.
Not every great athlete's like insanely, intensely
Michael
competitive.
Jordan levels of competitive.
Yeah. Nolan seems to be pretty competitive because go back to the All-Star game. Was it the San Antonio game he played in?
Yep.
Go back to the All-Star game. He was mad that they were chipping him. In other words, he got a couple sacks.
Double-teaming him.
Then they started, bringing over an extra blocker. He was kind of mad about that. Most guys don't care about All-Star games. They're just kind of there to be on TV and cheese with the cameras a little bit. Like Nolan was actually out there playing. So he's got a little competitive fire to him. So even though from a body type standpoint, that's not the perfect dodgeball player, I think that competitive stuff from him. I bet growing up as kind of a recess playground player, boy, I bet he tried to win at everything that he played in.
Unfortunately, in today's school system, the baby boomers have sort of written out dodgeball out of the cultural vernacular. And kids my age, millennials, we just didn't play a whole lot of dodgeball growing up, unfortunately.
But see, here's where sometimes Connor gets a bad rap for being a millennial. Here's where Connor is not a typical millennial, because I know him well enough to know that he is pro dodgeball. So for those of you who think Connor's
survival of the fittest.
Yeah, for those of you who think that Connor's just the worst of the worst when it comes to his millennial tendencies, when it comes to stuff like this, Connor is not very millennial. He's a little bit more of an old soul than you might realize. He's all in favor of dodgeball.
Yeah.
I would probably rank dodgeball it's probably the best playground game, probably.
Yeah, I would say probably.
Did you ever play kick and catch, where one person kicks and everybody tries to jump? It's almost like a Hail Mary, try to jump up and catch it. That's a pretty fun game, too. Andrew Hughes says, any black jersey news, BA? I do not believe that Georgia will wear the black jersey again in my lifetime.
Nope.
I think
we'll see him on recruits. Kendall Milton will wear one. Hopefully Arik Gilbert, if and when he comes to visit again, we'll see him in a black jersey.
I've said this before. The black jerseys are Georgia's dress blues.
Yep.
They are for ceremonial purposes only. The other day we saw Kendall Milton wearing the purple LSU jersey, which I think is a pretty cool alternate. LSU will wear those probably, 2 times a year at least? One time for sure, maybe twice.
Like they wear them for a special
game.
Yeah.
So they'll wear their alternates. Georgia is just for whatever reason not going to wear it. I've stopped even wondering about it. I just don't think it's going to happen. I don't.
Can I give you a theory?
I
think they might be waiting until they beat Alabama to pull them back out full time.
If that were to happen, that'd be really cool. I've always said, why not roll the dice, wear them against Alabama in December. Now, this year they weren't going to be the home team, but wear them against Alabama in December and actually just go back to the lion's mouth again to try to reclaim.
It can't get worse.
It can't. Yeah, at this point in time,
it can't get worse than losing 31-0 at
halftime. Dog Life says that wiffle ball was the best playground game. Yeah, we didn't have any wiffle ball equipment in my elementary school growing up. That was a really good backyard game, but that was not a playground recess type game for me.
Played pickle a lot growing up.
Pickle is a really fun game.
Fun game, similar
really
to dodgeball.
My son actually likes to play pickle now, so here we are, decades after the fact, and pickle is still a game. So I'm actually kind of happy to hear that. Dean Butler. Now this is prior to Connor's age, but I agree with this. He says he'd love to see Georgia wear the red breeches at Tennessee, an homage back to 1980. I'd be all in favor of this. Those red breeches with the red helmet, the white jersey looks really cool. But as I've told y'all before, this is why we can't have nice things. The moment Georgia started wearing red breeches again on the road, it wouldn't be 5 minutes later than y'all got them wearing a black jersey at home with the red pants and silver helmet, something like that. If it didn't start a slippery slope towards never wearing the same uniform more than once, I'd be all in favor of them wearing red breeches on the road because I really like that look.
I think if you were going to do it, I would specifically want it to be worn in 2030. I don't know if Georgia's going to be at Tennessee then or home, but I would actually hope that they're on the road at Tennessee that day because that would be the 50-season anniversary of Herschel Walker just plowing over Bill Bates. So yeah. I think that day, if you're ever going to wear it, circle that 2030 game.
Yeah, that's certainly worth.
By the way, Bobby Taylor brings up another Mount Rushmore Hall of Fame playground game, Foursquare.
Foursquare is really fun. Mm-hmm. Did you ever play the game where baseball players do this, and they do it with the baseball, although you can do it with the volleyball, where it's a little bit like Foursquare. You kind of stand in a circle and you bat the ball up. You've got 3 bats to get it to somebody. And by bat, I mean taps. You got 3 taps to get it somewhere else, and if you can't, keep the ball in the air, you're out. That's a really fun game. Mm-hmm. Russ Calhoun says Georgia should have a tradition of bringing out the black jersey after Thanksgiving for the rest of the season. I don't mind that so much.
Bulldog Chris brings up, what if they came out in black jerseys for the Notre Dame game?
I mean, at this point in time, as a way of just saying, we're just going to put these back in circulation and see how it goes. I mean, it's not the reason you would lose, and if you lose the game, it's a disaster anyway. At that point in time, you might as well go ahead and burn those jerseys if you don't win. So here's where David Josie goes. He says, why not all black pants, jersey, helmet? See, David, here's what you got to understand. And by the looks of your picture, you're a little younger than I am, maybe. It's a hard sell for me anyway to want to wear something that's not red jersey, silver breeches. I'm a bit of a uniform connoisseur. I like classic, traditional uniforms. I love the Georgia uniform. I think it's classic and traditional. So to get me to say, yeah, I wouldn't mind wearing the black jersey occasionally, that's already a pretty big concession on my part. To say, yeah, I wouldn't mind going back to the red breeches on the road. That's a pretty big, concession as it is. But here's where I feel like we're not in a good faith negotiation. When I say that, and then 2 comments later, how about all black from head to toe? I feel like I'm getting set up for failure at that point in time. Although I'm sure Connor would probably be happy with wearing a different uniform every week.
No, I just once a year for maybe a big game instead of Louisiana Lafayette, I'd like to see them come out in the black jerseys. I think just the simple black with the red helmets and the silver pants. I think it's a really, really clean look, and I would admittedly like to see that.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. Alan Rabanchik says, how about wear the black jerseys but not a blackout? I will say, and I know, it's been, unfortunately, memories of this have been kind of clouded over the years. That 2007 game against Auburn when everybody was in black, I mean, the whole stadium was completely black. I got to say, that was a pretty cool experience. I was really glad I had a chance to be a part of that there as well. All right, I've got to go. Our friends from Engineered Solutions of Georgia here, we're going to have a great time with them today. So I got to hop off and get ready to have a little lunch with them. Connor, any final well, Connor's already put his microphone out. This guy's already unplugged for the day. I was going to give you a chance at a final thought before we say goodbye.
A final thought, Chris Branham had the perfect summation of dodgeball. Sometimes in life you just got to get hit in the face. Builds character.
Yeah, listen, I think that. And also if you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball, I guess, there as well. All right, really good comments, y'all. We'll do a longer period on these tomorrow for sure. We appreciate your interaction and being a part of the program each and every day. Let me also get you to check in on ajc.com as well. There's a lot of news coming in Atlanta today. And one of the things I like to do is check in on the site over and over throughout the day. Get your Atlanta news now throughout the day, not just in the morning, but throughout the day at ajc.com. It's a great place to stay up to date on everything that's happening in your world and in your city, especially for those of you who live here in the Atlanta area. Check out ajc.com for that. And huge thanks as well to our friends at R.S. Andrews for bringing the R.S. Andrews cool down to you. Air, heating, plumbing, electric. They play all the positions for us here at DawgNation, kind of a utility player, but this time of year, it's really that air conditioning stuff that you think about because, let's face it, it's hot again. I got the pullover on right now, but don't let that fool you. We're in a nicely air-conditioned studio. If I was outside, I'd have to pull this thing off. And for many of you, you have to pull stuff off at home as well because of how hot it is. You want it to cool down at your home. That's why you want that $99 Smiley tune-up from my friends at R.S. Andrews. Reach out to them online at rsandrews.com. Till during the game we said hello. And get back to smiling again as your house gets cooled down again. We'll see you tomorrow here for DawgNation Daily. Y'all have a great day. This afternoon for Before the Hedges presented by Kroger. We'll do a little recruiting talk with Jeff Sintel. Busy week here on DawgNation. We're glad to have you as a part of it. Talk to you soon.